story that's been making headlines across the country.
A family thought they were adopting a 6-year-old girl from Ukraine, but was she really a child?
A friend of the mother accused says the Barnett family was scammed into their adoption.
Hey guys, my name's Brooke, and I really enjoy reading everything about strange occurrences, true crime, conspiracy theories, etc., and sharing my findings with like-minded and curious individuals. If you feel like you fit that description, please consider hitting the subscribe button down below. Investigation Discovery just put out a documentary series called The Curious Case of Natalia Grace, and when I tell you, this thing had me on the edge of my seat. I am not kidding you. So here I sit today to share this insane story with all of you. Unfortunately, if I could tell all the details of today's story, I would be here for literally hours, so I'm going to do my best to give you all of the pertinent details and information. But if you do have about 4 hours to sit down and watch this documentary, I would highly suggest it. If any of you have seen the 2009 horror movie titled Orphan, this case is just like that, except on steroids. The nature of this story just truly embodies the saying that there's 3 sides to every story: your side, their side, and the truth. And even after deep diving into this case and researching it for several days, I still really don't know what the exact truth is at the end. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's case. The Barnett family of Indiana is comprised of Michael the father, Kristine the mother, and their 3 sons, Jacob, Wesley, and Ethan. Kristine and Michael married in 1995, and from the beginning they worked really diligently to succeed in their dreams and make a life that their family could live comfortably in and be proud of. By the summer of 2010, the family was living extremely comfortably financially. They were moving into a brand new home, and their driveway was filled with luxury cars. Their eldest son, Jacob, was extremely intelligent, and he had autism. At the age of only 15, Jacob would appear on the show 60 Minutes, where he would recite the infinite number of pi by memory, like so many digits. I don't know how he did it. He's just really that smart. Around the same time, he would receive a full ride scholarship to Indiana State University, Purdue, and he would also receive an award from the Vatican, all at the age of 15. Kristine Barnett would end up transforming the garage and yard of their home into a daycare for children with special needs. They would also start a foundation where parents and children with autism could come together and really make a support system for themselves and just overall feel more comfortable with their position in life. Family and friends would say that Michael and Kristine seemingly had the picture-perfect marriage from the outside looking in. Feeling extremely secure, happy, and successful in their marriage, Kristine and Michael would decide that maybe it was time to add another family member to the mix. In April of 2010, Michael and Kristine had planned to travel to Haiti to complete an international adoption of a young girl, but unfortunately they would not be able to do that due to a hurricane that hit the area at the time, and the government shut down all international adoptions. It would seem that fate struck when the Barnetts would receive a phone call from an adoption agency in Florida. The adoption agency had heard about the Barnetts and their care for children with special needs and disabilities, and they had decided to contact the family and tell them that they had a 6-year-old girl from Ukraine named Natalia, and they wanted to know if the Barnetts were interested in adopting her. Natalia was born with a condition called spondoepithelial dysplasia, which is a form of dwarfism. After Natalia's birth in Ukraine, doctors would tell her mother that due to Natalia's condition, she would require surgeries costing over hundreds of thousands of dollars, that of which the young mother did not have the means to pay for. Ultimately, Natalia's young mother would give Natalia to an international adoption agency in the hopes that a family would adopt Natalia who had the financial means to take care of all of her medical needs. Upon contacting Kristine and Michael, the adoption agency would say that they only had 24 hours to decide if they wanted to adopt Natalia or not, and if they didn't, she would be put into foster care. Earlier that year, Natalia had been adopted by Gary and Diane Ciccone of New Hampshire, but after only 6 months, the parents would relinquish parental rights of Natalia. Believing in divine timing, yet knowing nothing about Natalia's background due to the nature of her closed adoption, Kristine and Michael took their 2 sons and jumped on a plane to head to Florida. The parents were really excited to add a daughter to the family, and their 3 sons would welcome Natalia with open arms. As soon as Natalia walked into the room, it was like she had been reunited with her long-lost family. Michael's mother would describe his emotions to be the same as he had expressed the day that his eldest son was born. Michael and Kristine would take the entire family of 6 to celebrate that day at Disney World. However, it was that night back at their hotel that things would take an extremely unexpected turn. While bathing their new daughter, Kristine and Michael would realize that the 6-year-old had fully grown pubic hair. Not long after the bathtub incident, Natalia would also admit that she had been menstruating and hiding it from the family. While this was extremely surprising to the parents who had never experienced anything like this before, I would just like to point out that it's not biologically impossible, and while it is rare, it does happen that children start puberty at extremely young ages. Unfortunately, this would be the start of a downfall for Natalia and her new family. Upon taking Natalia to their primary care physician, the Barnetts would learn that the doctor knew of another young girl who was also 6 years old and had the same rare condition that Natalia had. Wanting Natalia to befriend another girl who she could relate to, the Barnetts would set up a play date. Michael and Kristine would notice that when Natalia was sat side by side with this girl, Natalia seemed to be a lot older. She had more defined bone structure, her head was larger, and she was a lot taller. With these strange occurrences popping up, Michael and Kristine started to get a little suspicious about their new adopted daughter. When they would ask Natalia about her life in Ukraine, she said she couldn't remember anything about it, and despite living in Ukraine until she was 5 years old, she didn't understand any of the language, and she spoke English perfectly well with no accent whatsoever. The Barnetts claimed that it wouldn't be long before Natalia started exhibiting serious behavioral issues. Being that Natalia had been put up for adoption twice at this point, it was pretty clear that she had probably gone through a lot of trauma and was acting out because she didn't know how to handle it. 4 months into living with her new family, Michael would claim that Natalia just set out to make everybody in the house's life a living hell. Michael claims that Natalia would purposely urinate and defecate on her siblings' belongings. She would throw their toys out into traffic, hoping that they would get ran over. She allegedly put bleach in Kristine's drink one day, and she even supposedly began hiding knives under her bed and threatening to stab her siblings and parents. Truly unimaginable actions, especially for a 6-year-old. One specific event that was highlighted in the docuseries was when the family went to Trader's Point Creamery for one of their son's birthday. Michael would claim at the beginning of a walking tour at the creamery, Natalia would begin to complain of foot and leg pain due to her condition, and the fact that the parents did not buy her the proper shoes that she needed, so she was in a lot of pain. Kristine would sit down in the grass with Natalia and urge Michael and the boys to continue on to the walking tour. It's difficult to discern exactly what happened from this point forward due to conflicting recollections of the event, but here we go. In an interview given in 2019, Michael would claim that he and the boys would continue on the walking tour for only a few feet before hearing screaming, and they would turn around to see Natalia and Kristine in a physical altercation. Michael claims that Natalia began dragging Kristine towards an electrical fence nearby, saying that she was going to kill her. Despite standing at a whopping 2 feet 11 inches tall and weighing 45 pounds, Michael would highlight the fact that Natalia used her arms a lot due to her physical condition, and she had like some sort of superhuman strength or something. Michael later claimed that he and the boys were actually about a mile into the walking tour, and they only realized that something had occurred when they saw police lights in the distance, and they ran back to where Kristine and Natalia had been sitting. In this version, he claimed not to see any type of altercation, but he supposedly immediately thought that Natalia had killed Kristine when he heard the police sirens and saw the lights. According to Natalia, she really did need to take a rest and didn't want to go on the walking tour due to being in an extreme amount of physical discomfort from her condition. Kristine had initially volunteered to stay behind and sit with Natalia, but as soon as the boys started walking away, Kristine kind of told Natalia to toughen up and get up so that they can continue going on the walking tour. Kristine would reach down to help Natalia stand up, but then Kristine would just kind of throw herself to the ground and begin screaming and acting like Natalia was trying to kill her. Interestingly enough, the recollection of events told by a former employee who was working at the creamery that day would support Natalia's version of events. From his point of view, he just said that the whole thing was really suspicious and that it wasn't actually a big deal, and Kristine seemed to just be throwing a tantrum and making the situation a lot more dramatic than it needed to be. Another employee even stated that the electric fence wasn't even on at that point because the cows were at a different side of the farm. During interviews, Michael and Jacob would recall how their family basically lived in fear every day of their lives since Natalia had moved into the home. Natalia would meet with several therapists where she was eventually diagnosed with sociopathy. According to Michael, the professionals told her that there was nothing that could be done to help Natalia. There was no medication, there was no treatment, and they supposedly told Michael that he should lock her in her bedroom, and if she needed to go to the bathroom or eat, she should be escorted by an adult. For the sake of my own faith in humanity, I'm just going to put this one on Michael and say that this is one of his fabrications. And if a licensed mental health professional actually recommended that a parent do this to their child, I would just like to have a few words with them. After the farm incident, Michael and Kristine would take Natalia to the LaRue Carter Psychiatric Hospital, where she would be admitted for inpatient care. Upon the staff's discovery of her pubic hair, 6-year-old Natalia would be moved to the adult ward. Can we just stop here for a moment and acknowledge the fact that puberty occurs in children? A child experiencing puberty and having signs of growing into an adult does not make them an adult. I would just like to get that straightened out, because what is this rationale? It doesn't make any sense to me. Employees of the psychiatric hospital would state that Natalia displayed extremely aggressive and manipulative behavior. She would allegedly get physically aggressive with staff, and she would try to have inappropriate conversations with other male patients. With all of these factors combined with her physical development, staff of the psychiatric hospital began to doubt that Natalia was really 6 years old. They started to say that she was an adult. After only a month of inpatient treatment, the psychiatric hospital would say that Natalia could no longer be a patient due to conflict of interest with the other male patients, and Natalia would be sent back to live in the Barnett household. Throughout all of this torment, Michael and Kristine would not contact police about Natalia's behavior or their fear for her. In March 2012, neighbors would contact the Department of Child Services, but not for the reasons that you might expect. One particular evening, Kristine began questioning Natalia about her past in Ukraine, the people she knew, the orphanages she had been at, her real age, but Natalia wasn't talking. Kristine got so angry that she began stripping Natalia of her basic needs and told her that Natalia needed to sleep outside on the porch that night. Kristine would gather Natalia's blankets, put her and her things outside, and lock the door in her face. After 3 hours of Natalia knocking on the door to be let back inside and crying, Michael eventually gave in and let Natalia go back up to her room. But it wasn't long before Child Protective Services showed up at the family's door. Later on, the Westfield, Indiana Police Department would launch an investigation specifically into Natalia. Detective Klaus would present Natalia a photo of herself from 4 years prior when she had been admitted into the country, but Natalia did not recognize herself in this picture. Natalia would eventually reveal that the Ukrainian adoption agency had urged her to lie about her age to make it seem younger, due to the fact that adoptive parents typically go for children that are younger, typically babies, so that they can just have an experience to raise somebody from a baby to an adult and kind of get the full experience. When Detective Klaus would review Natalia's birth certificate and then her naturalization paperwork into the United States, he would note that in that 4 years, her height had not changed. Keep in mind that Natalia does have a form of dwarfism, but people with this condition still do typically grow a few inches in their adolescence. Upon discovery of this information, Detective Klaus would urge the Barnetts to take this case to the courts and have Natalia's age legally changed. I didn't even know this was a thing, but you learn something new every day. Natalia's birth date would be changed from September 1st of 2003 all the way to September 4th of 1989, making her 22 years of age instead of the 6 years old that she was originally. After being discharged from the state mental hospital and having Natalia re-aged as an adult, the Barnetts kind of saw this as an opportunity to just get rid of Natalia and wipe their hands clean of this entire situation. Kristine would soon place Natalia in an apartment complex in Westfield, Indiana. Neighbors in the complex were initially shocked to see Natalia wandering around the complex. She would try to carry in her groceries by herself. She would try to take the trash out by herself, but due to her short stature, she was just really struggling, and people just thought that she was a child left alone to her own devices. Being that Natalia was very lonely immediately following being abandoned by her new family, she would try to make friends with her neighbors. She would sit at home, peeking out the window from behind her curtains, waiting for her neighbors to come home so that she could immediately run outside, greet them, and have some socialization. She would even play with the neighborhood children since they were more her size. While most of Natalia's neighbors wouldn't mind socializing with her once in a while, it began to become a problem whenever they needed to be somewhere at a certain time, or they just didn't have the social energy to communicate with her, and she just kind of didn't know how to take social cues. She would just keep trying to talk to people for long periods of time, and they were kind of getting tired of it. Some of the neighbors would later point out that Natalia often had a strong body odor, and they began to wonder if Natalia even had the capacity to take care of herself, like cooking, cleaning, bathing, doing her own laundry. Her apartment was not suited for somebody her size, and it was really just not a good situation for her. At one point, when neighbors kind of began to try to avoid Natalia, some would say that she began entering their homes unexpected, unannounced, and they had to start locking their doors. They really wanted to be good neighbors to Natalia because they felt bad for her being so small and alone in that apartment, but they began to feel that she was crossing boundaries and that they were losing their privacy. This would lead to the apartment complex administration receiving several complaints about Natalia from her neighbors. I sort of feel bad for Natalia because regardless of her legal age, she has experienced a lot of abandonment at this point in her life, and whether she's an adult or she's a child, nobody wants to be left in an apartment alone all day where they can't even take care of themselves. On the other hand, if I was one of Natalia's neighbors, I would also be pretty shaken up by her just waltzing into my home, eating my food, talking to me when I'm not expecting it. I mean, that's pretty creepy, but this entire unfortunate dilemma could have been avoided if Michael and Kristine would have just, contacted professionals and found her a better home to go to, rather than just saying, we don't want to deal with it. Let's change her age and dump her in an apartment by herself. Natalia began telling her neighbors that the reason that she was left in this apartment alone by herself was that her family was afraid of her. She would casually bring up hiding knives in her room as if it was just a normal thing, and the neighbors were really concerned. They would later comment that it sounded like Natalia might have been coached to say something like this because it was just extremely odd how she brought it up so nonchalant. But this whole thing really made the neighbors unsettled, and they finally came to the point where they decided we should probably do something about this. Since Natalia was having difficulty taking care of herself, she was starting to just walk into people's houses, and she made comments about being potentially violent. Neighbors decided to contact the Department of Child Services. Social worker Heather Wilson would be assigned to this case, and it just so happened that she had also dealt with the Barnetts previously when they had locked Natalia outside of their home and tried to make her sleep outside. Due to Heather's familiarity with the family, she wasn't really convinced that Natalia was 22 years old, and she wanted to do all she could do to look as far into this case as she could and find out the truth. This, however, would prove to be quite difficult since Natalia had legally been re-aged to 22 and she was an adult in the eyes of the law. Once Michael and Kristine would learn about this investigation, it's safe to say that they were not happy about it at all. Michael began showing up to Natalia's apartment more frequently, but not for the reasons that he should have. He began questioning Natalia about her contact with the neighbors, and he even went as far as wiping all of the contacts out of Natalia's phone. This would include Heather Wilson's phone number, so Natalia wasn't able to talk with the social worker and report any possible issues that she was having. Not to mention, Michael would record a lot of these interactions with Natalia, and it's just extremely uncomfortable to watch because she's just sitting there like, what? And he's just like, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? Who's giving you food? don't talk to anybody, stay in here, basically don't exist. In the documentary, one of Natalia's former neighbors recalled a time when Kristine would take Natalia around the apartment complex and make her apologize to each and every single neighbor, saying that everything she had said about her family was a lie. Doesn't sound suspiciously coached or anything like that, does it? Due to all of the complaints against Natalia, the apartment complex would not agree to renew her lease, and Natalia would only live there for a year before she was forced to find a new place to live. In 2013, Kristine would take Natalia to Lafayette, Indiana, where they would find a new apartment for her to live in by herself. However, in this instance of abandoning Natalia, Michael and Kristine had decided to relocate to Ontario, Canada, in order to support their son's education and his pursuit of a master's degree at the age of only 14. Natalia really did not want to be separated from her family in the first place, let alone while they were moving to a completely different country. She didn't know how to take care of herself or be alone at that time. I mean, clearly she was not doing well in her first apartment. Lafayette is a town with plenty of nice areas, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Michael and Kristine were financially well off, but that would not stop them from placing Natalia in an extremely sketchy area of town. But because this apartment was within a couple blocks of a Salvation Army, a GED adult learning center, a grocery store, Michael claimed that Natalia was in walking distance of anything that she could ever need. From the perspective of an average-sized human, maybe this is a fair argument, but seeing as Natalia is barely 3 feet tall and disabled, this is just not a safe setup for her, and I don't see how he could claim that this is fair. And that's not even taking into the account that Natalia could very well be a child. Aside from the crime, sketchy people, and general disarray of her new neighborhood, Natalia also had to worry about climbing 4 concrete stairs and an additional 16 stairs just to get to her new second-story apartment. Much like her last apartment, this place was just not accommodating to her at all. She couldn't reach the countertops, she couldn't bathe herself properly. It was a mess. Michael and Kristine would also wait 3 days after moving in to finally decide to turn Natalia's electricity on. So she was just sitting there in the dark for 3 days. No power, no heat, no air conditioning. Luckily, the downstairs neighbors who lived underneath Natalia would take notice of this quite quickly. As soon as Michael and Kristine realized that they couldn't just get rid of their new daughter so easily and wipe their hands clean of her, they started to limit her contact with the outside world yet again. Before taking off to Canada, Michael and Kristine would take Natalia's phone completely so that she had no way to contact anybody, including 911, if something were to happen and she needed any sort of serious help. Complaints from neighbors would prompt authorities to basically force Kristine and Michael to give Natalia a cell phone, but it didn't have any contacts in it still. They would delete any contacts that she loaded into her phone. Oftentimes, Natalia still went without food and electricity, and authorities would continue to monitor the situation from a distance. One day after moving to Canada, Michael would receive a call from the adult GED center where Natalia would go for classes, and they would tell him that they hadn't seen Natalia that day and asked if the Barnetts had heard from her. Michael and Kristine claimed that they called around in efforts to find Natalia, but they didn't end up hearing anything until a few days later when she would fortunately show up. In just 3 days, Natalia had met and moved in with a woman named Cynthia Mann and her husband Bishop. Kristine and Michael then decided to be concerned about Natalia, and they would contact Adult Protective Services, who would look into Natalia's new living situation. It was found that Cynthia had taken $500 of Natalia's food stamps and used them to purchase food. In the docuseries, I think that it's interesting when they're asking Michael about this part of the story. He says it as if this Cynthia woman and her husband are some sort of scammers who are just taking advantage of Natalia, and they just pretended to be nice to her to get her $500. But then come to find out, Cynthia actually used this food stamp money to buy a bunch of groceries for Natalia and to cook her dinner every night and to make sure that she had regular meals. She had electricity in their home, and she was just overall taking a lot better care of Natalia than Michael and Kristine ever did. Michael was also extremely upset to find out that Natalia had signed over her Social Security payments to Cynthia instead of them going to Michael as they had been previously. In 2014, Natalia would eventually be evicted from that second-story apartment, but I'm 99% sure that she was better off living with Cynthia anyways, so Cynthia and her husband Bishop would petition the courts to become Natalia's legal guardians, but unfortunately they would be rejected. Cynthia recalled a day where Kristine had called Natalia's phone and she was just yelling and cussing at her and Cynthia on speakerphone, saying that Natalia has to go back to her apartment and that Natalia's crazy and she's violent. But Cynthia and Bishop had never seen any of this sort of behavior, so they were a little bit confused as to what Kristine was talking about. That same year, Michael and Kristine would begin the proceedings for what would be an extremely messy divorce after 15 years of marriage. Michael would claim that Kristine was not only extremely abusive and manipulative to him, but also to their 3 children plus Natalia, because I don't even know if they ever really considered her a child the way that they treated her. Michael would end up moving back to Indiana and Kristine would stay in Canada with their 3 sons. On September 3rd, 2019, Michael would receive a call from Detective Davenport of the Indiana State Police. Detective Davenport questioned Michael about Kristine and her attitude towards Natalia. It's at this point in the story where Michael just completely hangs Kristine out to dry and calls her the master manipulator of everything that has gone down over the past few years. He tells the detective about how Kristine would sit Natalia down and question her for hours and hours on end about her past life, who she really was, what her real age was, and when Natalia wouldn't comply with Kristine, she would make her stand up against the wall for up to 8 hours. This would not only be extremely painful and uncomfortable for any person, but seeing that Natalia had disabilities, she was in excruciating pain. At some points, this would even lead to her going to the bathroom on herself, while the family taunted her and said, "You can watch TV with us if you just tell us who you really are." Michael also stated that he once came home from work and saw Kristine sitting over top of Natalia, just absolutely physically assaulting her horribly. Michael turned over an audio recording to Detective Davenport where he brings up the assault to Kristine, and she doesn't deny it. She actually says that Natalia deserved it. Kristine had caught Michael making this recording and forced him to wipe the phone and reset it completely, but the FBI was able to retrieve the deleted data. Remember when Natalia said she was hiding knives under her bed? I wonder if it was for her own protection and not to kill her family. If that weren't bad enough, their eldest son, Jacob, would go on to admit that his mother urged him to urinate on Natalia's belongings and on her bed as a way to sort of get back at her. During the docuseries, Jacob was having an off-camera conversation with his father where he believed that his microphone was turned off, but it actually wasn't. And he confirms to his father that they wouldn't bring up the incident of kicking Natalia down the stairs. And Michael says they're not going to bring it up, but even if he did, nothing could happen as he was a minor at the time of it occurring. Kristine would allegedly line up all 3 of her sons who she would allow to physically discipline Natalia after she had done it herself. As an adult, Josh admitted that the actions that he took against Natalia at the direction of his mother are things that he thinks about every single day, and they really haunt him and make him feel extreme guilt. He says if he could go back in time, he wouldn't do any of those things to Natalia. Michael would also go on to detail Kristine's behavior during their divorce, saying that Kristine convinced him to relinquish all parental rights of their children by sending Michael intimate pictures of herself. In my opinion, if it's between having custody of your 3 young sons and getting some risque pictures, maybe pick your children. In order to get her sons on her side, she allegedly told them that their father wanted to physically harm them. I'm not going to get much further into the details of their divorce because I quite honestly don't think it's really relevant to Natalia, and Basically, Michael just wants everyone to know that Kristine is a master manipulator and she'll do whatever it takes to have control of any situation. But I will say that Kristine was having an extramarital affair with a little person who did claim that Kristine offered up Natalia as a sort of like date to this little person, and he was absolutely not having it. He said that's disgusting. She's a child, and he wanted nothing to do with it. After Detective Davenport asked why the Barnetts moved Natalia to Lafayette, Michael claimed that Kristine said it was, quote, a white trash town. No one is going to care. No one is going to notice. Kristine allegedly believed that if they moved her to this town with a lot of crime, that Natalia wouldn't be able to manipulate people into reporting her living conditions to authorities. Michael said that Kristine would even teach Natalia an introduction to recite whenever she would meet new neighbors, saying, "Hi, I know I look young, but I'm actually an adult and I'm extremely dangerous. I've tried to kill my family." Is that a chainsaw outside? Very fitting. During the questioning, Michael would also admit that he believed at the time that Natalia was actually 20 or 22, which would mean that when she was abandoned in the first apartment, she was actually 16 years old. During his investigation, Detective Davenport would fly to Ukraine in order to get a hold of and interview Natalia's biological mother. During her interview, Natalia's biological mother would state that she gave birth on September 3rd, 2003. Furthermore, if Natalia was really born in 1989, as her re-aging stated, then Natalia's mother would only be 10 years old at the time she gave birth, which is technically possible, but extremely unlikely, and is not what happened according to her biological mother. Upon hearing about Natalia's life since she had been given to the adoption agency, her biological mother felt absolutely terrible. She thought that Natalia would get adopted by a nice American family who had the means to properly take care of her in a way that the mother wasn't. Her biological mother would state that she wishes she had kept Natalia after giving birth to her so that Natalia didn't have to undergo all of the abuse, manipulation, pain, abandonment, and all of the terrible things that the Barnett family had put her through. Almost 2 weeks later, on September 12th, 2019, Michael and Kristine would both be charged with child neglect, and they would both turn themselves in to authorities and be bailed out about an hour later. Since Michael had agreed to cooperate with Detective Davenport, the two would be tried separately. Even though it seemed like the Barnetts were finally facing repercussions for their actions over the past few years, the case would not be as cut and dry as it seems. Since Natalia had been re-aged years prior, she was legally 33 years old at this point, and the case was no longer whether or not Michael and Kristine had neglected an abandoned child. It was about if they had neglected and abandoned a disabled adult. Due to the nature of the American legal system, the jury was not allowed to know that Natalia was potentially actually born in 2003, which would make her 19 at the time of the trial and not 33 as she was considered legally. The fact that Natalia was potentially a child when she was abandoned was null and void at this point, because in the eyes of the law, she was an adult, and it wasn't up to the jury to decide that. It's just absolutely crazy to me that the jury are expected to make a fair and reasonable decision based on facts and evidence when they're not even given access to possibly one of the most pertinent pieces of information because it's no longer admissible due to a questionable choice made in the first place. The woman who gave birth to Natalia is literally sitting here telling you she was born in 2003, but the jury can't know that. Michael hired 3 top attorneys who worked around the clock nonstop to make sure that he was not convicted of neglecting and abandoning a disabled person, not a child, a person. They taught him what facial expressions to use in court, what words to use and not to use, and just how to speak when he was on the stand. I'd also like to give a shout out to Cynthia Mann and her husband Bishop because, you know, it was funny a while ago Michael was claiming that they were scammers and they were taking advantage of a disabled person, but Cynthia and her husband stood by Natalia throughout all of these proceedings. Cynthia and her husband have just done so much for Natalia. I'm glad that she finally found a support system that she deserves and that she needed this whole time. In court, Michael recounted the events that he had originally shared with Detective Davenport, but when he got to the point where he quotes Kristine saying Lafayette is a white trash town and nobody will care, The jury was not too pleased considering that they were the white trash that Kristine was talking about. Michael just went along with that and agreed with her. So when Natalia was eventually called to the stand on day 3, she had to state that she was born in 1989 and not 2003. After only a couple hours of deliberation, the jury would find Michael Barnett not guilty of all 4 counts of neglect and abandonment of Natalia. Jury front person Jane Parker would say that during deliberation, all members of the jury were convinced that Michael was guilty of abandonment and neglect, but due to the judge and kind of how things work in the legal system and questions that couldn't be answered, it kind of just came to the conclusion that Michael couldn't be charged with these crimes. Jane said she went home that night after the trial and began looking up the Barnett family because Natalia had recently appeared on an episode of Dr. Phil where she was just trying to plead her case and say that she wasn't an adult. Everything the Barnetts were saying was a lie. And that is when Jane finally found out that Natalia is claiming to be born in 2003. Of course, jurors aren't supposed to know anything about the people or the case prior to the trial so that they can make an unbiased and informed decision. So when Jane found out that Natalia may actually have been a child the entire time, she felt like this could be a giant miscarriage of justice and she was just feeling really uneasy about it. Now that sidekick Michael has been tried and, let off free, it's time to go after Mastermind Kristine, right? Well, unfortunately not, because in March of this year, 2023, all charges against Kristine would be dropped due to insufficient evidence. The fact that these 2 individuals got off completely spot-free after making this girl's entire childhood a living nightmare is just beyond words. I cannot comprehend it. I feel so sorry for Natalia. As of 2023, Natalia is 33 years old, and I believe she is still living with the man's family, thankfully, who I'm sure are taking wonderful care of her, much better care than Kristine and Michael could ever. They could never. Natalia has stated that the Barnett family has told countless lies in order to cover up the abuse, the abandonment, the neglect, and she's ready to finally tell her side of the story. So part 2 of this ID docuseries is planned to come out sometime this summer, where Natalia gives her version of events. I will definitely be watching it, but even after hearing mainly the Barnett side of the story, which I can't even. If you watch the documentary, you're gonna see Michael's behavior, and I can't tell if he's actually convinced himself that the things he's saying are true, or he's just doing a terrible job of trying to act and make some sort of debut into the entertainment industry, but it's not it. So even after hearing the Barnett side of the story, I'm still team Natalia, so I'm sure once she tells her side of the story, it's gonna be even worse. In my opinion, the worst case scenario is that Natalia actually did have a lot of emotional and behavioral problems and that she did threaten the Barnett family. Even so, go get the girl some help. You took her to one mental hospital where they kicked her out the door and you're well, we tried. Let's just go dump her off in an apartment somewhere by herself where she can't take care of herself. While she did cause a lot of disturbances and discomfort to her neighbors, she was still a young girl who was left alone, and she was just begging anybody to give her some ounce of attention that her adoptive family just couldn't do it. Whether she was an adult or not, I really just don't understand how Michael and Kristine came out on the other side of this whole thing with absolutely no consequences or repercussions for their actions. If Natalia really was a child through all of this and maybe didn't even do all of the violent things that they claim she did, that just makes it that much worse. That just about brings us to the end of today's case. I tried my best to paint a thorough picture of this case with all of the pertinent details, but once again, if you have about 4 hours to binge watch something, I would highly recommend the docuseries, and you can just get all of the details, you can see the interviews, you can see the behavior, and make up your own mind about the case. Anyways, I love to hear your thoughts about this case down below in the comments, and if you have any recommendations for future videos or topics that you'd like me to cover, go ahead and leave that down below too, and I will take a look at them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!